On the outside, Christopher Langford's mansion stood as grand and unshaken as ever, but inside, it was a hollow shell. 2 months had passed since his wife, Margaret, had been taken from him in a sudden accident, and their 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, hadn't spoken a single word since. Silence hung in every room, heavy and suffocating. Then came Evelyn Carter, a quiet, reserved housekeeper with a past she never spoke of. She moved through the home with a gentle patience that somehow coaxed Sophie into smiling again. A sight Christopher hadn't seen in weeks. But for Christopher, that smile came with a sharp sting of doubt. Too many people had shown him false kindness after Margaret's death, only to reveal selfish motives. He told himself he could not afford to trust appearances, not with his daughter's fragile heart at stake. So he devised a cruel test. In the guest room, Evelyn cleaned every Wednesday. He placed Margaret's diamond necklace, her most cherished possession, in plain view. He instructed the DOPU, her security team, to disable cameras in that wing for 20 minutes. No witnesses, no interruptions, just temptation laid bare. From the hallway, he waited, watching Evelyn step into the room with Sophie by her side. What Christopher was about to witness would not only challenge his suspicions but begin to unravel everything he thought he knew about trust, loss, and the quiet power of presence. Christopher's heartbeat thundered in his ears as he leaned against the cold doorframe. Eyes locked on the scene before him. He had expected guilt, maybe even a quick flash of greed, but not this. Evelyn Carter stood at the vanity, the diamond necklace glinting in her hands. Sophie, his silent daughter of 8 years old, stood close by, her small fingers nervously curling into the hem of Evelyn's skirt. For a moment, Christopher was certain he knew what would happen next. Evelyn would admire the necklace, perhaps even slip it into her pocket when she thought no one was looking. He had seen it before, kindness turning into opportunism, the moment temptation appeared. But that's not what happened. Instead, Evelyn knelt down, so she was eye level with Sophie. The air between them seemed to hum with something unspoken. Sophie pointed timidly at the necklace, her eyes wide and glistening. Christopher couldn't hear the words, but he saw Evelyn's lips move in a quiet question, her hand brushing a stray curl from Sophie's forehead. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, Evelyn fastened the necklace around her own neck. She didn't glance toward the door. She didn't fidget or hide. She simply turned toward Sophie with a small, unsure smile, a smile that carried both gentleness and a question, as if asking, "Is this what you needed to see?" And then it happened. Sophie's lips parted, her voice raspy and trembling, the syllables clumsy from disuse. "You look like Mommy." The word struck Christopher like a blow. He felt his chest tighten, his breath catch mid-blank. Inhale. That voice, fragile, hesitant, and achingly real, was something he had longed for since the day Margaret's coffin was lowered into the earth. The last time he had heard Sophie speak was at the funeral, screaming for her mother not to go. Since then, nothing. Not a whisper. Not a single syllable. But now, her first words in months weren't for him. They weren't "Daddy" or "I love you." They were for Evelyn. For this quiet stranger, who had somehow reached a part of Sophie that he, her own father, could not. Christopher's hand gripped the edge of the doorway to steady himself. He had orchestrated this moment to catch a thief. To confirm the world's ugliness. To protect what little trust he had left. Instead, he had stumbled upon something miraculous. Sophie's small hands came together under her chin, her entire face lit with awe as she gazed at Evelyn. The necklace sparkled at Evelyn's collarbone, but it wasn't the diamond Sophie was seeing. It was a memory, a fleeting glimpse of her mother, alive again in the shape of someone else's kindness. Evelyn didn't cry. She didn't make a show of the moment. She simply lowered herself further, until her forehead rested gently against Sophie's, holding her shoulders with steady hands. Christopher could feel the gravity in that simple gesture. It wasn't possession, it wasn't pity. It was presence. It was a promise without words. Sophie reached up to touch the necklace, her small fingers brushing the cool metal. Evelyn let her eyes soft but unflinching. "She asked me to wear it," Evelyn's voice would later explain. "She wanted to remember her mother." Just for a minute. Christopher couldn't respond. His throat felt tight, his mind too full to form words. There was nothing to accuse Evelyn of, no reason to shout or question. What could he possibly say to the woman who had just given him back a piece of his daughter he thought was lost forever? In that moment, he understood that Evelyn had not taken anything from them, she had returned something priceless. The sound of Sophie's voice. The light in her eyes. The joy of connection he feared she might never feel again. The necklace, once a symbol of love and loss, now hung between them like a bridge, not to replace Margaret, but to help Sophie hold on to her without falling apart. Christopher felt the fight drain out of him, replaced by something heavier, something humbling. He had been testing the wrong person all along. The real test wasn't whether Evelyn could be trusted. It was whether he could allow himself to trust again. As Evelyn unclasped the necklace and placed it carefully back on the vanity, she didn't look to see if Christopher was watching. But when she finally turned, and their eyes met, there was no fear in hers. Only a quiet vulnerability, a readiness to let him believe what he wanted. Sophie stepped back toward Christopher, then paused, retreating instead to Evelyn's side. Her small hand slipped into Evelyn's as if it belonged there. Christopher didn't move to take her back. For the first time in months, he realized that it didn't matter whose hand Sophie held. What mattered was that she was holding on to someone again. He lingered in the doorway a moment longer, watching the two of them. Evelyn's calm, Sophie's fragile joy, the necklace still warm from the touch of love. It all felt like something sacred, something that didn't need his intrusion. So he stepped away, his chest aching not with suspicion, but with a quiet gratitude he didn't yet know how to express. In his mind, the echo of Sophie's words followed him down the hall. "You look like Mommy." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Christopher didn't just hear loss in them, he heard hope. It began with something so small that Christopher Langford almost didn't notice it. A folded square of paper slipped under Evelyn Carter's bedroom door. She found it early one morning, while carrying fresh linens down the hall. The paper was slightly crumpled at the edges, a faint yellow star drawn in careful strokes of colored pencil at the center. No name, no message, just the drawing. But she knew instantly who it was from. Evelyn didn't ask Sophie about it. She simply tucked the paper into her apron pocket and went about her day. The next evening, another appeared, this time a red heart, wobbly but unmistakable, its color pressed into the page with deliberate effort. Over the following weeks, the papers came more often. Stars, hearts, flowers, stick figures of a tall woman kneeling beside a small girl, always with the same unspoken message. She began taping them to the inside wall of her wardrobe. It became her private gallery, hidden behind neatly folded uniforms. Each piece was a fragment of trust, a language Sophie seemed to know better than words. Evelyn understood that children didn't give like this unless they were offering pieces of themselves, tentative, precious, and easily broken. One afternoon, she found something different. A small paper crane, folded with care. Inside, in Sophie's blocky handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for not leaving me." Evelyn sat on the edge of her bed for a long time, the paper pressed against her chest. Sophie didn't know about her own childhood, about the people who had walked away, about the silence she had once lived in. But somehow, the child had found a way to touch the one part of Evelyn's heart she thought she'd locked away forever. Christopher, from a distance, noticed the changes too. Sophie lingered longer in the kitchen. When Evelyn was there, even if she said nothing, she followed her into the garden, sat near her while she folded laundry, listened to her read aloud in the evenings. These were small shifts, but for a father who had watched his daughter retreat into herself for months, they were monumental. And yet, with each improvement, Christopher felt something tight in his chest, a strange mix of gratitude and regret. Gratitude because Sophie was returning to him, piece by piece. Regret, because it wasn't him bringing her back. He remembered all the times he'd tried. Expensive therapy sessions, planned activities, toys, trips. None of it had drawn Sophie out. She had met every attempt with a polite but impenetrable silence. But with Evelyn, there was no resistance. Sophie seemed to unfold naturally, like a flower, turning toward the sun. Christopher told himself it was because Evelyn had no history with their grief, no heavy shadow of loss tying her to the memories that haunted their home. Still, deep down, he wondered if the truth was harder to accept, that Evelyn simply had something he didn't. One evening, while returning to his office, Christopher noticed a folded piece of paper pushed under his door. Curious, he picked it up, expecting a note from staff. Instead, in Sophie's careful handwriting, were just 5 words. "Can Evelyn stay forever?" There were no decorations this time, no hearts or stars, just the plain, unvarnished question. He sank into his chair, reading it over and over. The words didn't change, but their weight grew heavier each time. It wasn't really a question about employment. It was about permanence, about the fear of losing someone again. Sophie had lived through enough absence to recognize the signs, and she was asking him to make sure this one didn't leave. Christopher leaned back, pressing the note against his chest. He remembered the way Sophie used to cry herself to sleep, the way she avoided eye contact, the way her voice had vanished. For months. And now here she was, speaking, smiling, and asking for something, not toys, not trips, not even for her mother. Just for Evelyn to stay. It struck him that Sophie's drawings, her paper crane, and now this note were all saying the same thing: I trust her. That trust was something Christopher hadn't been able to earn, no matter how hard he tried. And while the realization stung, it also filled him with a strange, quiet relief. It meant Sophie could still form bonds. It meant she hadn't closed herself off entirely. He sat there long after the sun went down, the house settling into its evening hush. The note stayed in his hand, then found a place in the top drawer of his desk, resting above legal contracts and financial reports that once seemed so important. In that moment, those 5 words outweighed all of them. For the first time in months, Christopher didn't feel the need to solve anything immediately. He didn't have an answer yet, not for Sophie, not for himself. But he knew this much. When his daughter spoke, even in writing, he needed to listen. And perhaps forever wasn't a demand at all. Perhaps it was a plea. And deep down, he suspected Evelyn had already earned it. It was a date Christopher Langford never spoke of aloud, not to friends, not to staff, and certainly not to Sophie, Margaret's birthday. The morning felt heavier than most, the kind of weight that settled into his bones before he even left his bed. He hadn't marked it on the weight calendar, hadn't bought flowers, hadn't done any of the small rituals they once shared. Avoidance had become his shield, and silence his only defense. He drifted through the morning in a haze, retreating to his room after breakfast and closing the curtains as if the darkness could hide the ache. Downstairs, the air in the house seemed to shift with his absence. Evelyn Carter worked quietly, checking on Sophie every so often, though the little girl seemed unusually restless. Around mid-morning, Evelyn noticed something unusual, a faint trail of flour dust on the kitchen floor, the prints far too small to belong to an adult. Curious, she followed it down the hall and into the dining area, where Sophie sat cross-legged against the wall. In her hands was a single cupcake, slightly lopsided and burnt at the edges, its top crowned with a messy clump of sugar. Beside her lay a small wooden match and a stub of wax candle. Evelyn's breath caught. Sophie looked up, her expression solemn but determined. She didn't need to explain, the meaning was in her eyes. She remembered. This wasn't just a cupcake, it was a tribute. A child's way of honoring the mother no one else seemed brave enough to mention today. Without a word, Evelyn lowered herself to the floor beside her, their shoulders brushing. She didn't ask how Sophie had managed it, didn't comment on the mess in the kitchen. Instead, she reached for the match, struck it once, and lit the small candle Sophie had nestled into the cupcake. The flame trembled, fragile but steady. Sophie stared at it in silence, her lips pressed tightly together. Evelyn rested a hand on the girl's back, rubbing slow circles. Then, softly, almost like singing to herself, she began to hum. Happy birthday. Her voice was unpolished, slightly unsteady, but warm. She didn't fill in the name. She didn't have to. Sophie closed her eyes, letting the quiet melody wrap around them both. Upstairs, Christopher had finally left his room in search of air. He was halfway down the staircase when the sound reached him, not the words, but the unmistakable rhythm of the song he hadn't allowed himself to hear in over a year. His steps slowed, his chest tightening. With every note, from the shadows at the foot of the stairs, he saw them. Evelyn and Sophie sitting side by side on the floor, a single flame flickering between them. The sight stopped him cold. He had avoided Margaret's memory all day, telling himself it was for Sophie's sake, that speaking her name would only reopen wounds. But here was Evelyn, who had never met Margaret, holding her memory like something sacred because Sophie needed it. It wasn't jealousy that gripped him, but something far more fragile, awe, and a deep, aching guilt. He hadn't been the one to give Sophie this moment. He hadn't been the one to acknowledge the day. He wanted to step forward, to kneel beside them, to put his hand on his daughter's back and share the memory. But shame kept him rooted to the spot. He felt like an intruder in something too delicate to touch. The candle's light danced across Sophie's face, catching in her eyes, and Christopher's throat ached at the sight. They didn't blow out the flame. They simply sat there, watching it flicker until it burned low. The silence between them was heavy, but not empty. It was full of presence, of unspoken love. Christopher stayed in the shadows until the flame finally went out. Sophie leaned against Evelyn's side, her small hand curling into the fabric of her skirt. Evelyn didn't speak. She didn't try to turn the moment into a lesson or a story. She just stayed, steady and warm, holding the memory with the kind of respect Christopher hadn't realized he'd been craving for himself. When he finally turned away and walked back up the stairs, his chest felt different, not lighter, but more open. He understood now that Evelyn hadn't just stepped into their house to help with chores or watch over Sophie. She had stepped into their grief, not to change it, but to share it. And in that quiet act, she had honored Margaret in a way Christopher had been too afraid to try. It happened on a quiet morning, the kind where the house seemed to breathe in long, slow sighs. Evelyn Carter had been gathering fresh linens for the upstairs rooms when she opened a door she thought was the linen closet, and froze. The air in the room was different, heavier, as though it held its breath. She knew instantly where she was. Margaret Langford's bedroom. The bed was perfectly made in soft ivory sheets, untouched for months. The closet doors stood slightly ajar, rows of dresses hanging in pristine order. A framed photo rested on the nightstand. Margaret smiling, her arms around a laughing Sophie. Evelyn didn't move further in, but something in her chest tightened. She understood without being told that this room had been sealed, not out of forgetfulness, but out of grief. She might have left immediately, but her eyes fell to the single gardenia Sophie had handed her earlier that morning, a bloom the girl had plucked in the garden and shyly pressed into her palm. Evelyn stepped forward just far enough to lay it gently on the pillow. She didn't touch anything else. She didn't linger. She simply left the flower behind, a quiet offering, and turned to go. When she reached the door, Christopher Langford was standing there. His expression was unreadable, but there was no anger in his eyes. He said nothing as she passed, and she offered only a small nod. For a long moment after she left, he stood at the threshold, staring at the posadere gardenia, resting on Margaret's side of the bed. It was the first thing to disturb the room's stillness without feeling like a violation. That night, Christopher returned to the room alone. He sat on the bed for the first time in months, the flower still on the pillow, and felt something shift, not an erasure of grief, but a loosening of its grip. In the days that followed, the walls between them began to thin. It wasn't dramatic, just small, human moments that seemed to happen without planning. When a summer storm rolled in one afternoon, Sophie grew tense, retreating to the corner of the kitchen with her knees pulled to her chest. Evelyn knelt beside her, whispering softly, her hand steady on the girl's back. Christopher arrived moments later, unsure whether to step in, but instinct pushed him forward. He knelt on the other side, wrapping his arms around both of them. Sophie didn't resist. For the first time in months, she leaned into him, her fingers gripping his shirt. Evelyn began humming a lullaby, and together they stayed like that until the thunder passed. Another afternoon, Evelyn suggested they walk to the lake behind the house. At first, Christopher hesitated. The lake was too steeped in memories of Margaret, but something about the way Sophie's eyes lit up made him agree. They went together, the three of them. Sophie ran into the shallows, splashing, her laughter carrying across the water. Christopher couldn't help but scoop her up, spinning her in the air until she giggled uncontrollably. When he glanced back, Evelyn was standing at the edge of the trees, watching. He held out a hand, inviting her to join them. She stepped forward, closing the distance, and together they sat on the shore skipping stones, the sunlight catching in Sophie's hair. Evenings sometimes found them in the library. Evelyn would choose a book, Sophie curled up beside her as she read in a low, even voice. Christopher would linger in the doorway, pretending to be busy, just to hear the soft cadence of Evelyn's words and the way Sophie's breathing slowed when she was comfortable. None of it erased the loss, but each moment layered over the grief with something new. Connection, trust, a sense of safety. And slowly, Christopher realized he was no longer standing outside the circle they had formed. He was part of it. Not by force, but by choice, theirs and his. For the first time since Margaret's death, the house didn't feel like a mausoleum. It felt, in fragile, uneven steps, like a home again. The moment had been building for weeks, a slow current beneath the surface of daily routines, shared silences, and moments Christopher Langford hadn't dared to name. It began the morning he stood in the kitchen doorway, holding a small silver key between his fingers. Evelyn Carter was at the sink, rinsing the last of the breakfast dishes. When she turned, her eyes caught on the glint of metal in his hand. "What's that?" she asked, drying her hands on a towel. Christopher stepped forward, placing the key in her palm. His voice was quiet, deliberate. "There are no locked rooms anymore." She glanced down at it, brow furrowing. "I don't understand." "It's not for a door," he said, nodding toward the living room where Margaret's old jewelry box sat on a low cabinet. "It's for that. There's something inside I want you to have." Hesitation flickered across Evelyn's face. Still, she followed him to the box. The key turned easily in the lock, and when she lifted the lid, her breath caught. Resting on a bed of velvet was Margaret's diamond necklace, the same one Evelyn had once fastened around her neck. At Sophie's quiet request, the same necklace Christopher had used weeks ago in a test meant to expose her. Evelyn stepped back as though it burned. "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "I can't accept this. It was hers. It's Sophie's memory of her mother. I won't take it." "You're not taking it because of that day," Christopher said gently. "You're taking it because of who you've been every day since you walked into this house. You've given us something I didn't think we'd have again, a home. This isn't just jewelry, Evelyn. It's a promise." Before she could answer, the sound of small footsteps echoed down the hall. Sophie appeared. In the doorway, her school bag still slung over one shoulder. Her gaze shifted from Evelyn to the open box, and her eyes lit with recognition. Without a word, she reached for the necklace, then looked up at her father. "Put it on her," Sophie said. Christopher blinked, surprised. "Lily, please," she insisted, holding the necklace out to him. Evelyn's protests faltered under Sophie's steady gaze. She turned slightly, allowing Christopher to clasp the chain at the back of her neck. The cool weight settled against her skin, and before she could react, Sophie stepped forward and placed her small hand over the pendant. "Now it's yours too," she whispered. Evelyn's throat tightened. "Are you sure I should wear this?" she asked softly. Sophie nodded without hesitation. "Yes. Because you're not leaving." It wasn't a plea or a hope, it was a truth, spoken in the simple certainty only a child could have. Evelyn's eyes shimmered, though she didn't let the tears fall. She placed her hand over Sophie's, covering the necklace between them. Christopher stood close, one hand resting lightly on Sophie's shoulder, the other on Evelyn's back. For a long moment, the three of them stayed there, unposed, unhurried, as if none of them wanted to break the fragile completeness of it. Evelyn didn't reach for the key again. She didn't need to. The gesture had already unlocked far more than a jewelry box. It had opened a space, in the house, in Christopher's guarded heart, in Sophie's fragile trust, where she belonged. In that stillness, Christopher realized something he hadn't dared admit even to himself. This was no longer about what Evelyn did for Sophie, or even for him. It was about what they had become together. A family not bound by blood, but by choice, by healing, by the shared decision to stay. For the first time since Margaret's death, Christopher felt the weight in his chest shift, not the first time since Margaret's death. Gone, but transformed into something that could be carried. And as Sophie smiled up at Evelyn, her fingers still resting on the necklace, he knew that this promise, given in quiet sincerity, was one they would all keep. The offer had arrived in the most unassuming way, a cream-colored envelope tucked into the day's mail, its weight almost nothing in the hand, yet impossibly heavy once opened. Evelyn Carter recognized the return address instantly. It was from one of the most prestigious private schools in the country, a place she had once dreamed of working for back when her life still followed carefully drawn plans. Inside was everything her younger self would have wanted. A full teaching position, generous salary, housing allowance, health benefits, even the promise of her own classroom. It was a future wrapped neatly in formality and opportunity, a career milestone she might never have imagined saying no to. But as she stood in the kitchen that afternoon, the letter open in her hands, the sound of Sophie's quiet laughter drifted from the next room where Christopher Langford was helping her with a puzzle. That sound was the rarest music in the Langford house, one Evelyn had fought to help bring back. She didn't need to think long. Without reading the offer again, she folded the letter, slipped it back into its envelope, and set it on the counter. 10 minutes later, it was buried under a pile of used paper towels in the trash. It wasn't reluctance that kept her from reconsidering. It was clarity. Later that day, Christopher came into the laundry room with the trash bag in hand. As he tied it closed, a corner of the cream envelope peeked out from beneath the paper towels. His eyes caught on the elegant return address. Curious, he pulled it free. The seal was still intact. He didn't open it. Instead, he stood in the doorway to the kitchen, watching Evelyn and Sophie bent over the table, their heads close together as they worked through Sophie's math worksheet. The moment was so easy, so natural, that it felt like something that had always been there. When Evelyn stepped away to put a kettle on, Christopher followed her quietly into the laundry room. Without a word, he held up the envelope. Her eyes landed on it, and for the first time since he had met her, he saw real hesitation, not polite deference, but a flicker of vulnerability. "I didn't open it," she said softly. "Didn't need to." Christopher tilted his head. "Why?" His tone was gentle, not accusatory. "It looks like a great opportunity." Evelyn took a breath and met his eyes. "Because I don't want better," she said, her voice breaking just slightly. "I want here. I want her." She nodded toward the other room where Sophie's quiet voice carried through the doorway. The simplicity of it stopped him. No one had said anything like that to him in a very long time. For so long, people had wanted things from him, his resources, his influence, his approval. Evelyn wanted none of that. She wanted this life, in this house, with Sophie. Christopher stepped closer, his voice low. "Then stay." There were no conditions, no caveats, just the words she had been waiting to hear, though she hadn't dared to hope for them. Her shoulders relaxed, and a faint, almost disbelieving smile touched her lips. That evening, the three of them sat together on the front porch. The summer air was warm and still, carrying the faint scent of the gardenias that lined the walk. Sophie was curled between them, her head resting in Evelyn's lap, eyelids drooping in the comfortable quiet. Christopher sat with one arm along the back of the bench, his fingers brushing lightly against Evelyn's shoulder in a gesture so natural it barely registered. Evelyn absent-mindedly stroked Sophie's hair, humming a tune Sophie had come to know as hers. There was no rush to fill the silence. This was not the silence that had haunted the house for months after Margaret's death. This was the kind of stillness that came when people were simply present with one another, when nothing was required except being there. After a while, Sophie tilted her face toward Christopher, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can we be always now?" The question didn't startle him. He didn't need to think. He rested his hand gently on her back and answered, "Yes, baby. From now on, we are always." Evelyn's eyes met his over Sophie's head. Neither of them spoke, but something passed. Between them, recognition, trust, and the quiet knowledge that this moment was the answer to questions neither of them had dared to ask out loud. Evelyn glanced down at Sophie, whose breathing had already begun to slow, and felt the truth of her choice settle deep inside her. She could have gone to that school, could have had the career she once thought would define her, but it would have meant leaving this, the laughter that had returned to Sophie's voice, the unguarded moments with Christopher, the fragile but steady life they were building together. Some things, she realized, were worth more than the dreams you once had for yourself. Some things were worth staying for. As the porch light glowed against the deepening sky, Evelyn leaned back slightly, allowing the rhythm of Sophie's breathing and the quiet presence of the man beside her to fill the rhythm. Space. She wasn't just choosing to stay in a house or in a job. She was choosing a life, one built not on ambition, but on connection, on showing up, on the slow work of turning grief into something gentler. And she knew, without needing to speak it, that this was where she was meant to be. The evening was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt alive, filled not with absence, but with the soft hum of belonging. The porch light cast a warm glow over the three of them as they sat together on the old wooden bench. The air was scented with the faint sweetness of gardenias, the sun melting into the horizon in streaks of gold and rose. Sophie was curled between them, her small body leaning into Evelyn's side, one hand absently twisting the chain of the diamond necklace around her neck. Christopher sat on the other side, his arm resting along the back of the bench, his fingertips occasionally brushing Evelyn's shoulder in a gesture so unthinking it no longer felt guarded. There were no words. For a while, they didn't need them. The simple fact that they were there, together, was enough. Then Sophie tilted her head, her voice a soft whisper that carried more weight than she could No. Can we be always now? The question stilled the air. Christopher turned to look at her, his eyes softening. There was no hesitation, no need for careful phrasing. Yes, baby, he said, his voice both steady and warm. From now on, we are always. Evelyn glanced at him over Sophie's head, and in that shared look, something unspoken passed between them, not just an agreement, but a vow. This was not a promise bound by law or blood. It was something quieter, stronger, built on presence, trust, and the slow mending of hearts once broken. Sophie's eyes fluttered closed, a small smile tugging at her lips as she leaned more fully into Evelyn. The weight of her trust, so hard-won, settled between them like a gift. The porch around them seemed to fade, leaving only the warmth of the moment, the feeling that, for the first time in a long time, there was no rush to protect themselves from loss. It wasn't about perfect days or grand gestures. It was about showing up, about staying when it would have been easier to leave, about choosing to belong to each other despite the risks. This, Christopher realized, was what family meant. Not the name on a birth certificate, not the resemblance in a photograph, but the decision to hold on, to be always in a world full of maybes. As the first stars began to pierce the sky, Evelyn kept her gaze on Sophie's sleeping face, her hand resting gently over the child's. She didn't need to say it aloud. She was staying. She was part of this always now. True family is not just the one you're born into, it's the one you choose to fight for, the one you nurture with patience, love, and unwavering presence. Healing doesn't happen in a single moment, but in the accumulation of countless quiet ones, where you simply show up, again and again. And sometimes, the greatest promise you can give someone is not forever in grand terms, but always in the small, everyday ways that matter most. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Has someone ever been your always when you needed it most? Your voice matters here. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and like this video so we can keep creating more stories that connect, inspire, and remind us all of the quiet power of love that chooses to stay.